who is the Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow at the Middle East Institute and founder and president of Eyre Analytics. He's also a expert, super expert on Iran, having worked on the Middle East for many years as a professional diplomat, over 40 years government career. And I'm delighted to be having you on, Alan. Now, there's a lot of things moving as usual, but I think quite a lot in the diplomatic angle right now. So I think the first thing I would love to get your thoughts on is, where do we actually stand with these supposed talks? Um, Trump claims they're making great progress. Iran says it has no idea what he's talking about. Who's telling the truth?
As much as it pains me to say it, the Iranians are. There are no negotiations, so they couldn't be making great progress. What there are messages being passed through intermediaries between Iran and the United States. We know that Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, and Oman have all expressed a desire to play the role of intermediary. I think Pakistan is the one who is responsible for the latest exchange of messages, but this is in no way characterized as negotiations. Even before the latest war, there were no real negotiations going on between the two sides. But messages are being passed, and the messages from the U.S. have been demands that are even more maximalist than they were before the war started. And the Iranian side, not to be outdone, has passed its own set of hyper maximalist demands that the U.S. couldn't possibly meet. So this might evolve into negotiations because it's clear that President Trump is seeking an off ramp, but it could well be the case that for the moment, Iran still doesn't feel it's reached a point in terms of inflicting pain on the U.S. and the West that it can accept a ceasefire and start to wind down.
So there's a lot of speculation around what exactly Trump's trying to do here, other than perhaps some people just say it's Trump being Trump and he's talking absolutely preposterous claims. But on the other hand, people say that it's part of a smoke and screen strategy, that he's trying to claim peace is being made, or progress is being made over peace, whilst building up the necessary military assets to, I don't know, undertake a limited operation, seize Karg Island, these sorts of things. Is that something that can happen? Is it something that the US does? Does Trump do it? Talk us through some of your experiences.
Well, I don't think President Trump has a strategy. I think this is a war he was talked into in part by Israel. He seemed to believe that there could be a quick victory a la Venezuela, where after some serious bombing and decapitation, whatever was left of the Iranian regime would either topple and be replaced by a more user friendly regime, or at a minimum, be more willing to accept American demands. Neither of those has happened, as was obvious to anyone who follows Iran with any degree of detail. So right now he's just making it up. And again, he keeps thinking that by increasing pressure on Iran, an Iran that is obviously weakened, he can get them to capitulate, but that's not the reality. The reality is that even though Iran is overwhelmingly mismatched from a military viewpoint, it has a greater tolerance for pain than the US does, and it still can maintain enough residual ability to threaten the Strait of Hormuz, to keep it closed, or at least to regulate those ships that are able to pass through it. So I think President Trump is sending troops obviously toward the region with the threat of escalation. Seizing Karg Island would just cause Iran to escalate by attacking energy infrastructure in the Gulf, which I don't think anyone wants. And even if the United States could, in large measure, stop the export of oil through Karg, it would take far too long for that to have any real effect. And by that point, I think Iran could have done so much damage on the Gulf countries and on the Strait that it would be a Pyrrhic victory for Trump.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I think it's important to always highlight the multifaceted nature of this situation, because I think a lot of people who are leaning very much one side will always emphasize one specific angle. So in the US-Israeli camp, it's very much, while they're being battered and bruised, dominated militarily. Yes, but that's only one angle, and I think it's a very limited one to look at. But that being said, to sort of counter argue that own point, some people emphasize that if the US launches a special military operation, God, I just used that word, phrase, but like a specific operation of special forces designed to take Karg Island, right, that they could put enough disproportional pressure on Iran for them to at least approach talks with a genuine interest.
Yeah, again, the every sentence of mine has the implicit start of I don't know, but because no one knows. This is war. A war is taking a complex system and shaking it up, And so predicting what complex systems will do when they've been disturbed is not something human beings are good at. So no one can predict the second and third order consequences of what this war is going to do to the region. But you're right. It is theoretically possible that President Trump could land troops on Karg and Iran says, okay, that's it. We will now accept the U.S. maximalist demands. I think it unlikely, because don't forget, the more troops you put on the ground, the more targets you give Iranians. And one of the things the Iranians are looking to do is put a lot of American soldiers in body bags. So far, thankfully, they've been quite unsuccessful, only around 13 or so, which is 13 too many as far as I'm concerned. But still, one of the ways to put pressure on President Trump is to up the domestic political pain. And one way of doing that is by killing American soldiers. So you put soldiers on Karg, that's just another target.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with you. I think it's political and military suicide to think that seizing this facility, even if it does process 90% of oil production and whatever refinement, these other islands that Iran can use, other areas that they could leverage, other facilities. I think so. It doesn't solve the underlying issue there. And I understand your point about we're only speculating, but I think that isn't there a degree of informed assessment one can make based on experiences from the past, right? Otherwise, we can never make any steps about anything.
No, obviously. But my point is just that this is, I'm a former diplomat. I tend to speak with assurance. Don't confuse that with 100% certainty because
Sure.
No one knows. I can remember I followed Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988. When Ayatollah Khomeini said, I'm going to drink from the poison chalice and accept the ceasefire with Iraq, everyone was surprised, right? But, war has surprises. So all you can do is give your best guess.
No, certainly. And I think the comparison to the Iran-Iraq War is what makes this so difficult, because that was obviously hugely land-based, but there's no land component to this at the moment. And I guess that's why there's a lot of speculation. Of course, the media, which we try to speak through the noise on shows like this, is freaking out about the idea of a ground invasion. But, you're based in DC at the moment, I believe.
Yep.
And what's the sentiment amongst professionals that you're speaking to in Congress, on the Hill? The polls I see, most Americans do not want any form of ground operation. There might be some MAGAs who support some limited specialist kind of op, but the appetite for some kind of quagmire, which this already to me is, doesn't seem there. So, I mean, what are you hearing?
Yeah, again, there's sort of confirmation bias. I tend to talk to people who think like me, but I mean, the consensus of sort of inside the Beltway is this was a massive strategic own goal, a massive strategic miscalculation by the Trump administration. Some people argue that even though initially it was a mistake, there's a saying, if you strike at the king, you must kill him. So the fact that we've now attacked Iran again, what we've done, among many other things, is increase their desire to recreate and reestablish the strategic deterrence they lost, immediately before, during, and after last year's 12-day war, to include possibly seeking a nuclear weapon. So unintentionally, we've done regime change. The regime change we've done, though, is put a far more hardline militaristic government or regime in Iran than might have otherwise been the case. If Ayatollah Khomeini, the late one, had died in his sleep, you know, without a war, it's probable that Mojtaba would not be the supreme leader. And again, if there hadn't been a war, it's quite possible that whoever was running Iran right now, the IRGC, it would not be as hard line as and as militarized as it is now. So again, we have rolled the dice, and I think the consensus here in Washington is that this is a quagmire that is far more likely to get worse than it is to get better. So it would behoove this administration to cut its losses, declare victory, and stop, and get Israel to stop.
Well, I want to come to Israel in just a moment, but on this point, there's been a lot of one of my biggest fascinations, and some other guests that I've spoken to on the program over the past, gosh, it's nearly, hang on, it's a month today, isn't it? It's a month today since we started this whole matter. So in the past month, I've been speaking to a great array of people and voices, and one of the biggest curiosities I have is what comes after, right? Mojtaba is not been seen, so there's people wondering whether he's a vegetable or actually functioning. But his relationship, he seems to be much more pragmatic. But basically, the IOGC, you've referenced the point about militarized state. Are we going to just see an Iran that internalizes, becomes a security / police state, and therefore maybe isn't as much of a regional player as it once was, but is still a potent threat in its own way?
Well, that was a dynamic that was already happening. The militarization and nationalization and the declarification of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, has been happening since 1988, the ceasefire and the death of Ayatollah Khomeini. So Mojtaba, for the short term, it's irrelevant whether he's dead, incapacitated, or in the pink of health. He's not the one running things right now. It's the IRGC and the what's called the Beit Rahbari, which is the leader's house, which is the administrative structure through which the supreme leader exercises control. It's very extensive. So that's the reality now. In terms of what happens in the future, the prime imperative, once this war stops, however it stops, for the people running Iran is to reconstitute strategic deterrence. The three pillars they lost, missiles, proxy network, and a nuclear program that gave them the option of building a nuclear weapon. All of those have been severely denigrated, if not obliterated, though they can reconstitute all three of those. They've also found a new strategic deterrent, which is exercising control on the Strait of Hormuz. So they don't have to build back better what they lost in terms of strategic deterrence, but they have to come up with a new strategic deterrent formula that prevents Israel and the United States 6 months from now or a year from now from mowing the lawn again and attacking them again. How that plays out is in the eternal dynamics between guns and butter, Iran will be spending its money on guns. And again, this just means that the ongoing immiseration and increasing poverty for the Iranian people will continue.
Yeah, I think we can get lost in the noise or chaos of what's happening in the military, and we forget the humanistic side. So I appreciate that. But on another note, though, about the JCPOA, there's been a lot of speculation around Trump trying to sort of re-engineer it, or basically it's just a JCPOA 2.0. It reminds me of NAFTA, when he just re-engineered the same bloody agreement, but put the USA at the front just so that it, the USA first or America first. So what is going on there? Do you have any insights on the sort of the conditions of what they're saying? Is it basically the same thing as what Obama's administration had negotiated?
Well, first of all, I have to point out that any deal that President Trump gets from the Iranians right now will be not as good, will be worse than the deal he could have gotten had he not attacked, right? Now, the difference between what Trump was trying for before the war and what President Obama had was indigenous enrichment. Whereas the Obama administration and the JCPOA allowed Iran to enrich uranium on Iranian soil with severe verification measures and severe limitations on the quantity of uranium they could enrich, how much they could enrich it to in terms of percentage, and also the quality of centrifuges they used. Um, we allowed Iran to maintain enrichment on Iranian soil. The Obama administration, which wanted a better JCPOA, said, no, you can't have any enrichment, Iran. This is before even the 12-day war last year. They said, we will not accept Iran having any capability to enrich on Iranian soil. And now its demands, that you can believe what's been reported, are even more maximalist in the sense that no enriched uranium, either high enriched or low enriched uranium, dismantling of all the key Iranian nuclear facilities, and obviously no enrichment, with the U.S. providing whatever Iran's nuclear needs are. That's an obvious non-starter for Iran. Regardless of the internal logic, the hill that Iran will die on, literally and figuratively, is the right to enrich uranium indigenously. And that's for a whole bunch of reasons, to include the fact that Iran has internalized the strategic message of you can't trust any other country, you can't trust the West. So it wants to retain their right to enrich uranium, not because they need nuclear power. Only 1% of Iran's energy is derived from nuclear power. That's Bushehr. And Russia provides the enriched uranium for that. So let's be honest. The reason Iran wants the ability to enrich is because it gives them the ability to build a nuclear weapon.
But isn't that to take the side of the opposing view for a second? Like, isn't that fair? Because why can't they have a nuclear weapon if other countries do? Whose right is it to determine that they can't? And the other argument being that even if they did, they have to now because it's the thing that they need. It's the existential argument. It's the only thing that they can ensure their survival as a regime.
Well, I don't think it's the only thing that can ensure their survival as a regime. And I hear this argument a lot, like Israel has a nuclear program, India, Pakistan. True, but none of them are signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was created in the Eisenhower administration, creates a two-tiered system. Those people who already had nuclear weapons get to keep them. Those who don't are allowed the peaceful use of nuclear energy if they promise not to build a nuclear weapon. And the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, is the policeman that inspects those countries to make sure that they're not trying to build a nuclear weapon. And again, one of the reasons we're into this problem is that Iran has consistently not lived up to its NPT obligations, and has consistently not allowed the IAEA to do that which it wanted to do to verify that Iran was living up to the deal. So you're right. It is hypocritical in a larger sense. Why should Israel have a nuclear weapon and not Iran? But I would argue no one should have a nuclear weapon, to include the great powers. But also, Iran, as a member of the NPT, needs to live up to its obligations. If it wants to pull out of the NPT and then say we're going to build a nuclear weapon, that's a whole other set of issues concerning from a different point of view. But the in terms of international law, you're either in the NPT with rights and responsibilities, or you're not.
But isn't international law irrelevant now? I know some people are not going to like me to say that, but Trump's not exactly living up to it. You mentioned Venezuela. Well, if the United States and many other countries are not adhering to international law, what relevance does it have anymore?
It has decreasing relevance. You're right. You don't have to look at Venezuela. This war is illegal, according to international law in the United Nations. Iran was not an imminent threat to the United States. So this was not a preventative war. So yeah, you're right. President Trump and his administration have said, in essence, we don't care about international law. The Secretary of Defense has said, we don't care about rules of engagement. This is not going to be a woke war. We're going to, do lethality, do war fight, or whatever the hyperbole he uses. So you're quite right. We're moving toward a far more Hobbesian, might makes right world, where the traditional and conventional rules of what countries should and shouldn't do have less and less attention. And that's a less stable world. That's a more destabilized world We're already seeing that. So, Iran, looks at history. It looked at Libya, which tried to accommodate with the West under pressure. It looks at Saddam, which tried to bend the knee to the U.S. under pressure. It looks at the USSR, which tried to reform under pressure. All those countries fell away, all those regimes. So the message that Iran has internalized is if you're under pressure, that's the exact wrong time to compromise because that will just invite further aggression, which is why Iran, as of before the 12-day war, was increasingly unlikely to agree to maximalist US demands because, in its mind, the US is just seeking to topple Iran. And if you show weakness by agreeing to maximalist demands, that just invites more demands.
So we talk about Hegseth's hyperbole, we talk about the maximalist demands, but here we are. Has maximum pressure failed?
Well, again, it's so far it has. Again, decisions are probabilistic, right? You make a decision based on uncertain information, and just because it doesn't work doesn't mean it wasn't a good decision. So, President Trump tore up JCPOA and said, let's do maximum pressure. If it had worked, we all would have been like, wow, good decision, right? Because it's Annie Duke, who's the World Series of Poker champion, who now talks about decision and decision theory and decision hygiene, talks about how you shouldn't judge a decision based on the outcome because a lot of it's just luck. If Israel and the US had struck Iran, Khomeini died, and the new regime collapsed, right? People would have been saying, wow, bold decision. Now that hasn't happened, and it wasn't likely to happen. So in retrospect, I feel confident in saying that President Trump made a horrible decision, but I'm just saying it's all probabilities right now.
Well, as with everything, there's a reason game theory is based so much on economics, the Nash equilibrium, all that. So what about the diplomatic intermediaries here? One thing I think is quite interesting, although my audience didn't seem to share that because I made a video on it yesterday. No one really paid much attention to it, which is a shame. But I thought it was quite interesting, which is the efforts behind the scenes, right? The Omanis, the Pakistanis, the Turkish, the Saudis, the Emiratis, whoever it is. Talk us through how that works a little bit, and does each one have its own vested interests, so it's more about the general, just regional stability at this point?
No, no one cares about regional stability. They care about their own, neck of the woods. So each one of these countries is suffering and will suffer more from the war. And so each one of them, for their own selfish reasons, is trying to stop it. Again, there are intermediaries that are better and worse than others. You want to have an intermediary that both sides can trust, that will be a fair, relatively fair broker, or at least pass messages and, but to a large extent, it's not that important. The best intermediary is just a facilitator. It's just a tube. It's like if you have a Petri dish, right? You could put in growth material. It could be, great or good. What makes it, worthwhile is, do you put the stuff in that's going to reproduce, right? So whether it's Pakistan or Qatar, it doesn't matter if the two sides are so far apart and are so distrustful of each other that regardless of who is the intermediary, who is passing messages, they're just not going to come to an agreement. And that's where we are now.
So you mentioned the divergences, but that also exists within the US administration. Marco Rubio has an effort to try to, keep a lid on things, versus Trump and the others who are like, yeah, gung ho, let's go all the way. So not only do we have divergences of opinion or objectives between Israel and America, but within America and the administration. How do you look at that?
I have to fervently disagree with that. The United States decision-making apparatus is unipolar. There is President Trump and only President Trump. Look at any cabinet meeting that's televised. It consists of every single cabinet member spending huge amounts of time praising President Trump. Marco Rubio obviously has his own opinions, and he'll make the case to President Trump, but it's not as if they're competing centers of power. Marco Rubio has no power. Pete Hegseth, no power. Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner. President Trump is the decider. He's got about 4 people he talks to. He talks to Mr. Witkoff, Mr. Kushner, maybe Marco Rubio, certainly not Pete Hegseth. I don't think he's in the room for these decisions. Maybe 1 or 2 others. And then he decides what to do. But in the old days, you had a foreign policy apparatus. You had State Department. You had the intel community. They gathered information. They analyzed it. They've developed possible policy options. It moved up to the system, arrived at the president's level. He made a decision. None of that is happening now. The policy is formulated and implemented at the topmost level. Okay? The State Department is not a player. Okay? Intelligence communities, I don't think they're providing policy options, but they're still, gathering information and answering President Trump's question. But there is no one pushing back seriously with any real power against President Trump. Though I think more and more people are saying, and he has very fine domestic political radar, that if you keep this up, you will get beaten like a hobby horse in the midterm elections.
When I mention about divergences of opinion, it's not because I'm saying that they have the ability to influence the final decision making. I'm just saying that there is a divergence of opinion, right? There are Tulsi Gabbard has she didn't even know about Venezuela's operation. She was uploading selfies on a beach, if I remember correctly. And some people argue that she wasn't in the room on the final decision to go ahead with this operation at Epic Fury either. So that's more the point. Does that not have any influence or sway on things at all? The cohesion within administration of the US, as you mentioned, as a machine, that doesn't have any sway on America's ability to operate functionally in the Middle East.
There's a theory in Shia jurisprudence called ijma, which is consultation, which is where, it's basically you just get people with informed opinions in a room, they discuss it, and by consensus, a prudent course of action comes out. It's sort of reflected in the saying here in the West, the smartest person in the room is the room, right? Consultation tends to give you a solid answer. That's not happening, as you point out, in the U.S. administration. There is no ongoing discussion of people with expertise and experience to derive an optimal policy. There's magical thinking, okay? There's, this could work, and let's try that. President Trump evidently bought the bill of goods from Israel that we could do a massive quick strike, decapitate Iranian leadership, and what was left would either be willing to deal with the U.S. in a more open way, or there would be regime change that would lead to a more user-friendly Iranian regime. Neither of those happened, and the perfectly predictable consequences that anyone who has any expertise thought would happen are happening, which is Iran, as opposed to previously responding proportionately, if not performatively, is responding disproportionately, if not indiscriminately, because it needs to restore the strategic deterrence it's lost and has been losing over the last couple of years. So this is a circle that cannot be squared.
Okay, and when it comes to Israel, I mean, they have you insinuated that if America and Iran were to find some common ground, however unrealistic that may seem right now, I mean, it seems to me pretty obvious that the Israelis will continue their operations regardless. Does that change the calculus of either side? Does it change the calculus of what happens in the region, or it's so much different because the world's biggest military power is no longer involved?
I don't agree with that in the sense that, again, for Iran's point of view, Israel and the U.S. are logically equivalent. So it doesn't matter if the U.S. stops and Israel continues. But it is the case that the U.S. can make Israel stop. And this is why we're seeing, in the last day or so, Israel picking up the pace of its targeting against the defense industrial base, against missile production, and because it fears that President Trump is looking for an off ramp, that he's getting, according to Western press, bored with this war and wants to move on to something else to hold his attention. So Israel's war goals are collapsing this regime. It doesn't necessarily want regime change, but it wants regime collapse. It thinks that Iran is an existential threat, and it doesn't think that it's a threat that can be dealt with on the negotiating table. So it wants the nizam, which is Persian for the regime, to collapse. Okay. And that's what it's trying to do now. But now, because it fears President Trump will soon be turning to Israel and saying, stop, it's trying to do as much as it can to degrade or destroy Iran's defense industrial base and its ability to produce missiles.
So you don't think that Israel will continue this even if the United States discontinued? Trump got bored.
I think that if President Trump turns to Israel and says clearly and concisely, Bibi, you need to stop, Israel will have to. But you're quite right. And, the only country where this war is popular is Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been besieged on many fronts politically in terms of his domestic popularity. But this war is a big winner for him.
Yeah, he still faces those indictment challenges, I believe, and the ultra-nationalist government it's chomping at the bits for this opportunity, I think. But I guess moving forward, then, what would a change of system look like? Or it isn't going to be. It's going to be what we mentioned with the IRGC in power. Iran will emerge from this battered, bruised, but still largely functional, and it will just self-isolate.
No, I think again, probabilistically, Iran, I think, will survive this. The regime will survive this. It will be more militaristic. It will be more hardline. I think, once the war ends, we'll realize that Mojtaba is not fit to lead. They might pick someone else, and to a large extent, it won't matter who they pick in the short term because the IRGC will be running things. The economy will be a lot worse. Again, one of the reasons that Iran is not willing to go back to the status quo of before the war is because it needs money, which is why it's asking for reparations, which is unlikely, which is why it's seeking sanctions lifted, which is why it's trying to, have a toll booth on the Strait of Hormuz, because it's going to need money. But it's going to need money to reconstitute its lost deterrence. It's not as if Iran is now going to say, we need to do a better job providing essential goods and services to the Iranian people. It's going to say, we need guns, lots of guns, so missiles and things like that. So it's going to need to find a new formula for strategic deterrence. And yeah, the Iranian people are going to be less well off than they were before. The Gulf region will be less stable because, again, also the Gulf countries are profoundly disappointed in the United States. The United States has prioritized defense of Israel over defense of the Gulf countries. The weaponry and hardware that the U.S. sold the Gulf countries weren't any help, right? They're still getting bombed. So the security umbrella that the U.S. has extended to the Gulf countries has proved woefully insufficient, but it could be to an extent that the U.S. is the only game in town. So I'm not saying the Gulf countries will seek security guarantees necessarily from just China, but they're going to start thinking about hedging their bets.
Yeah, on the alliance partner network, so to speak, there's obviously a lot of debate around those, again, pro-Israel, pro-America, are claiming that the Gulf states are on the verge of imminently entering. There was this suggestion that the British were going to lead some coalition to deal with demining earlier on in the week, but I haven't heard anything about that since. What does this do to the state of the US and its relationships with not just the Gulf states, but of course broader Europe?
Again, it's the acceleration of a trend where America first has become America alone. You talk about how the current administration has no real regard for international law, nor does it have any real regard for the rules-based international order and for coalitions and multilateral action. It doesn't care about international institutions. It doesn't care about the existing strong web of alliances we've had with our traditional allies. The Trump administration is very transactional. It deals in personalities. I like that guy. I like that gal. I don't like that guy. I don't like that gal. And it's based on how much money, the administration gets out of it. It's zero sum as opposed to win-win. The U.S. administration is not into win-win. It's into I win and you lose. And we're saying nothing about the enrichment of the sort of the network of friends around President Trump. The fact that Mr. Kushner is making so much money off the Gulf countries, that Mr. Witkoff and his family are making so much money, and profiting from administration activities. So, yeah, the international system's a lot weaker. Our alliances are a lot weaker. And regardless of what happens next, the U.S. is far less of a moral force. There are conversations going on globally now where before people would say, well, let's bring the United States, and it's not happening. So we are making ourselves less relevant and less trustworthy.
And to then flip it on its head, the same question, we talked about allies, but what about adversaries? I've made a video or two on China, Russia, and naturally the Chinese don't really have to do anything. They just have to allow the Americans to self-sabotage, and they win quite a lot. But can they do more? Can they leverage it even more to their advantage to be seen as the sort of Middle East mediator, as they did between the Iranians and Saudis, 2-3 years ago now?
Well, I don't think they actually did much in the Saudi-U.S. Iran rapprochement, and I don't think they want to extend a security guarantee to the Gulf. It's a thankless job, and they've got other priorities right now. But yeah, you are certainly right that both China and Russia are gleeful at this massive self-destructive act. First of all, we're massively depleting our armaments, our weapons, and our missiles that would be need to used in any conflict China related with Taiwan. That's going to take years to replace, if we even have the rare earth minerals we need to replace some of these theater air defense interceptors, radar systems. And we've also shown China the way to beat us, or at least the way to cause damage, which is instead of high ticket expensive fragile U.S. weapon systems, have a lot of cheap drones and just swarm, So, yeah, we have. And again, if you look at, for example, at President Trump last year, his administration in November put out a strategic document. Iran wasn't mentioned at all, right? It's all China is the pacing threat, Russia also a threat. We're throwing money at Russia via oil sales with this war. We have massively degraded our ability to focus power, in the area of operations near China, the South China Sea, and everything there, by burning through money and weaponry on this, unneeded and illegal war. So, but then again, let me sort of, I don't want to sort of make it sound by omission that I'm pro-Iran. I'm certainly not. Iran also has massively shot itself in the foot by attacking the Gulf countries that it needs so desperately. So I'm not saying Iran has been smart either, but they're fighting an existential battle for their own survival, whereas the U.S. is fighting a purposeless war of choice. So that's why Iran, made an incredibly dangerous yet essential decision to attack the Gulf allies.
But do you not think that came at because of the loss of Khamenei, and therefore that tipped it over from just being about reciprocity or proportionality and precaution in international law to we just want to bomb everything because we've lost the symbolic leader of our theocratic.
If Khamenei was alive, they would have done the exact same thing. It wasn't a personality issue. I mean, Khamenei was conservative, and actually, in many ways, as strange as it sounds to say, played a restraining role in Iran. But I mean, the reason that Iran attacked the Gulf was because they had no other way of inflicting pain, right? Their whole purpose was to regionalize and internationalize the pain. If they had just attacked Israel, it would have served no purpose. So that's why they did attacks on the Gulf and also closed the Strait of Hormuz, because that's the only tool they had in the toolbox, right?
Okay, fair enough. I mean, I've heard that argument by a lot of people that this is something that Khaname was sort of actually keeping the IRGC or even more arduous entities in sort of check, which I think is kind of terrifying to think given his statements before. But I guess my last question for you, Alan, this has been a really interesting conversation. We should definitely do it again very soon.
Sure.
Is what would you be, if you were sitting on the inside, what would you be saying to those, regardless of whether or not Trump listens to you? But perhaps you're one of the 4 people you mentioned who's able to persuade the commander-in-chief to take notice of your stance. What would you be recommending him? What would you be saying?
Stop. You know, it's
Okay.
like,
but no more than that.
No, but that would be that's the title of the paper. You know, stop. You know, it's like a physician says do no harm. I'm saying do no more harm to U.S. strategic interest and to the world economy. Not do more harm to Iran. But it's only going to get worse. All the prevalent dynamics here, you cannot escalate enough to cause Iran to submit. So at this point, declare victory, say, I have prevented Iran from having a nuclear weapon ever till the Perusia, till the end of times. I have stopped Iran's ability, missile program. I've stopped their proxy network. I've blown up their navy. It doesn't matter if these statements are true. This administration says tons of stuff that's obviously not true. The key point is declare a victory and just stop and get Israel to stop. Now, here's the problem. Once we've done that, Iran will still try to exercise control over the Strait of Hormuz, at least for a little while longer, just to show that it has control and that it's not doing what Trump wants it to do. And at the end of the day, the U.S. will not clean up the mess in the Persian Gulf. It's going to be left to the Gulf countries and other powers to find a new modus vivendi, a new way of interaction with Iran that prevents them from exercising ongoing control over the Strait of Hormuz, right? That's not fair. It's like, the Colin Powell rule was if you break it, you own it. The Trump rule is if you break it, let someone else try to fix it. And that's what's going to have to happen.
Not our problem. No, I think that's a pertinent point to end on, Alan, but it's been an absolute pleasure. And certainly I don't see this wrapping up anytime soon. But a lot of people reckon that by tonight, because the markets will close Friday night, that troops will be on the ground, and that's when we'll be in the next phase. But I'm not convinced. I don't think the right conditions are there. And Trump was making some rather vague statements at some domestic appearances he made earlier. So not convinced, but we shall see. And everyone watching, thank you very much. Do check out Alan's work at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Very good stuff. And be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and stay tuned up to date with all the latest from not just the Iran war, but of course the war in Ukraine and everything that relates to, the global gambit. Take care.